Here we are live. Okay, wonderful. So, hi everyone, welcome back to Navigate. Thank you everybody for joining us. It's lovely to see all of you who have your cameras on, but don't worry if you don't, that's absolutely fine as well. The chat is not part of the YouTube live. Just another heads up to confirm for everybody. This is being recorded on YouTube live, as it always is. And if anyone wants to ask any sensitive questions, that's okay, it's fine. It's not going to be a public link. It will be only privately sent around to anyone who's signed up for the course. But we're also going to retain 5 minutes or so at the end. So if you want to keep any questions that you feel uncomfortable to ask, that will then be posted in a semi-public forum, then we'll allow for that as well. So welcome again. Good evening, everyone. And welcome to Rebbitzin Dr. Hadassah Fromson, who's joining us today all the way from Golders Green. Rebbitzin Dr. Hadassah is a doctor in counseling psychology and is a community Rebbitzin at Golders Green Shul. Her psychology research and practice focuses on sexual and relationship satisfaction in the Orthodox Jewish community. Hadassah teaches brides before their weddings, and she has a private therapy practice in Golders Green. She runs psychoeducation and training seminars, and she's also currently training to be a Yotzet Halacha at Nishmat in Jerusalem. A Yotzet Halacha is a female leader and scholar and teacher who specializes in the teaching of women in halacha and women's issues. She also works for Chana Charitable Trust, I think, is that right, Hadassah? Chana Charitable Trust, which is a Jewish charity that deals with infertility and sexual dysfunction, among other things. Hadassah also has children of our own, so we're very lucky to have her because she speaks both as a parent as well as with her professional voice. So I feel that you are so well placed to take us through this journey of, well, what I've called Let's Talk About Sex, but speaking about sexuality and intimacy with children. So I'm going to hand over to you, Hadassah, and I'm also just going to make sure that everybody is muted.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rebbitzin Shoshana. And I am going to share my screen with you because we have lots of really fun slides to look at. Now, even though it's slide heavy, I'm just going to share my audio with you as well because we've got a little video at some point. Can you all see this PowerPoint? Thumbs up? Yeah, amazing. And you see it all in big now, like a presentation? Yeah, amazing. So let's talk about sex, speaking to children about sexuality and intimacy. As mentioned in the introduction, this really became something of interest to me when I was doing my research for my doctorate, which is called Does Religion Spoil Your Sex Life? And I looked at the relationship between religious levels, sexuality, religiosity and sexual satisfaction. And something that really came out from that was the type of education that different people, different religious levels get. And we're going to be looking a little bit at that research today. I do want this to actually, for it to be the most useful, I would love for this to be an interactive session where you can ask questions, you can, I'm going to be asking you questions, and I'm really good at awkward silences, so I will wait until you say something. It's one of the things that I learn in my profession, but I would love you to really, for this to be useful for you, and partly, whenever we're talking about children, what we need to do is cast ourselves back to when we were kids and think about how were we brought up and how do we want things to be different. So it's going to be important to sort of take our own experience as part of this learning. And in the beginning, I'm not going to be giving you direct tools on how to talk to your kids about sex. We're going to do a bit of that at the end. But the beginning is really going to be about thinking about what are your attitudes towards sex? Where do they come from? Because before you can give over the messages, you have to know what messages you want to give. So we are gonna start. And Shoshana, can everyone unmute themselves if they want to? Yeah, they have the power. Great.
Yeah, should be able to.
Fantastic. Okay, so the conversation everyone dreads, right? My question to you is, do you dread it or not? I'm interested, I'm intrigued. Francesca is not sure.
I don't.
Who said that? Oh, Ilana.
But that's not fair because I'm a biology teacher.
Very, very good. Okay, so you have confidence because of having to teach this to lots of
I
children.
think I might embarrass the kids more than I think I want to shut up about it more than.
Okay. Yeah. And it's actually really interesting to notice sometimes generational shifts, that like our generation is less embarrassed than like if you would ask a previous generation. Anyone else? No? Okay, so some reasons you might be here tonight at this talk. I know you've signed up to a course, but obviously you don't have to come to all the talks. So these are some of my thoughts, and I'd love you to pitch in. Maybe you're dreading the talk, depending on how old your kids are. You've had the talk, but not sure you did it right. Possible. You're not dreading it, you're just not ready for it. Or you really have no idea what to say, right? Those are some options. Are there any other reasons why, of what you're interested in here tonight? Yeah, Ilana?
I was just going to say, sometimes you don't get a chance to have it because your older kids have told your younger kids.
Yeah, or they had in the playground. I mean, the way I learned about it was my friend basically when I was in year 5 or year 6, she told me, like, this is what happens. The penis goes in the vagina and that's how you have a baby. And that's how you get pregnant and have a child. And the rabbi has 11 children. So imagine how many times he's done it. And I just looked at her and I said, how dare you talk about the rabbi that way? Like, that was literally my reaction. And I don't think I quite believed her actually for a year or two. So sometimes it's not even the siblings. Sometimes it's friends, and you hope they get accurate information, but you would be surprised by what people do get. Any other thoughts?
I don't experience it so much as the talk. It seems to be much more ongoing than that. And I think particularly because they've had probably much better sex and relationship education than we did, or I did when I was at from primary school and through to secondary school. I suppose for me, sometimes I'm perfectly comfortable talking about all the functional, biological, that side of thing. I suppose it's more when, as they're growing up into teenagerdom, my kids are nearly 14, it's kind of asking questions about what about you, and what, when they turn it and they ask about personal experience, and it's like, oh, you can't ask me anything like that. That's the kind of uncomfortable bit for me.
I hear that. You brought up some really important points that we're going to be exploring. Thank you. Yes, Ilana.
So just one more thing, like, things shifted. Like, these kids now have to know about consent, and they have to know about caring. I mean, like, even in year 8 biology, like, when we do the female biological parts, they don't include the clitoris on the key stage 3 curriculum, and I'm sort of think things have sort of shifted a little bit. Like, what we as parents are expected to actually teach our kids is not the same as what we got, even if we did get education.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, everyone. And you've totally said a few important points, that it's not one conversation, it's lots of conversations. And if you think about it, even if we started talking between ourselves, it's a nuanced topic. Like, how many of us feel completely comfortable with our own sexual ethic and understanding, and contradictions and discrepancies? And sometimes we don't know why that we think that that's inappropriate. We can't articulate it. It's just a gut feeling. And sometimes we're totally fine with things that we shouldn't feel fine with, right? So it's not a simple topic. It's not like just about passing over information. There's a lot of nuance. And even as adults, we grapple with it. Even as adults, we get embarrassed about things. So it's a lot more complex than teaching them about other parts of themselves. Okay, show of hands to start off with. Okay, so if you could put your hand up to start with, and then put your hand down as this becomes less relevant. Okay, so hands up. Keep your hands up if you were a child. Good. There's only a few of you that I can see, but I assume everyone has their hands up. Keep your hands up if you were a child with curiosity. Good. Keep your hands up if you first learnt about sex from a friend like me. Interesting. Oh, you're thinking about it. 2 of you, okay. Keep your hands up if you had an honest and open conversation with your parents about sex. You're not sure how honest or open it was, okay, or if it was about sex, okay. And keep your hands up if you had questions about sex that you wanted to ask your parents but didn't feel that you could. I mean, I had questions about it, but I didn't feel like I could ask them. So a lot of you felt like you could ask your parents questions about sex. Okay, good. good. So I hope those questions just brought to light sort of the different complexities that there are with children. So all children are curious. They don't always get their information from the right places. And I never really had a proper honest conversation about sex. I don't even think my parents actually still know what my doctorate was about. So it changes a lot with different people. But as we all, I'm sure you all know this, but it's important to realize that your child's attitude towards sex will have an impact on their ability to be in a relationship with one of the most important people in their life. So it's a huge deal, right? It's not just like, we hope they'll figure out somehow. Like, this will have massive effect. And their ability to feel comfortable with their own bodies and to feel comfortable with sexuality will have an impact on their relationship. Sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction are highly correlated. It plays a really important role in a couple's relationship. But the problem is that their relationship with sexuality happens with themselves before they even enter this relationship. So it's an important part of their lives, but we either sometimes do feel awkward discussing it with them, maybe not the biological aspects, which is a great shift in society, but maybe the more personal aspects, like the actual nitty-gritty stuff about how a relationship works. Like, anyone can show a diagram and say, this goes into here. But like, when you talk about how to make someone feel appreciated or valued, or not make someone feel used, or consent is a huge issue that's clearly not being passed on. I'm sure, are you aware of this? Everyone's invited, by nods of heads. Everyone's invited. So it's a big thing that's come out where someone, a young 22-year-old woman, basically developed a forum for people to submit anonymous stories about things that are sexual harassment that's happened to them. And all they do is they just name the school that they were from and that the boys were from. And there's been a huge flood of stories, and it's been quite shocking to schools and the system about how there's been this massive failure of girls going to schools, and not even co-ed schools. Sometimes it's just that, they're in separate schools, but then they hook up and these things happen. It's actually very shocking. And you think, wow, there is a massive failure in education here about boundaries and consent. And that's something that's just come up in the last few weeks in the news. So that's things to think about. So my question is, and this is what came up with my thesis, is, if not from you, then from who? Who are your children learning about sex from? Now, I'm assuming there's a variety of ages here, like from 0 to 15. Does that encapsulate all of your children? Yeah, amazing. So let's just really, before we answer it about how to talk to your kids about sex, let's just really think about it. Where are they learning about sex from? What are your thoughts? Where do they learn about sex from? I told you I'm really good with awkward silences, so I'm just happy to
You're getting occasional comments, by the way, if you can see the chat.
I can't see it, actually.
You can't see the chat? Oh, okay, I didn't think you could, because you've missed a couple. Ilana says Netflix.
Yes, Netflix. Yeah. Okay.
I think worryingly for children, even as young as, I don't know ages, but even as young as 10, there's also access to pornography, either by their peers or accidental access online. Yeah. So I think for some people that's a very harsh and jarring introduction.
Yep, and in COVID that's gone up a lot, the use of pornography in teens. Any other places that you think they learn about sex from, or attitudes towards sex? Because like, we're not just talking about how one gets pregnant, we're talking about, again, the values of sex. So part of my research, Ilana, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, people said on the chat friends, and the people said school. Yeah.
Friends, school.
I would say parents, watching how their parents interact as well.
Yeah, exactly. All these places. So my research, what I did is I carried a study that had 600 participants that came from a wide range of Jews and non-Jews, mostly looking at Jews, but modern Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and non-Orthodox Jews. And what I found is that in the Orthodox and non-Orthodox groups, well, the modern Orthodox and non-Orthodox group, only 30% were learning about sex from their family. And only 8% of ultra-Orthodox were learning from school, and 32% were learning from color classes. So we're looking at low numbers. Modern Orthodox and non-Orthodox, only 25% learn from school and 20% from Kali classes. So we're really seeing like the schools at the moment, there is a big shift right now. I'm actually going into a few different schools to be talking about like sexual education policies. But until now, there has not been great sex education in schools. And as you all know, your generation, there was like probably hardly anything. If you got sex ed, it was like how not to die from sex, how not to get pregnant from sex, and how not to get ill from sex. That's it. That is not the entirety of sexuality. If anything, that's something called negative sexual education, because it's all about the negative things of it. There's a whole area of positive sexual education, how to have a healthy sexual relationship, which isn't even addressed. And even nowadays, it's not so addressed. Consent, still part of negative sexual education, not quite positive sexual education. So the question is, where's everyone learning from? So as you mentioned, there's TV, there's others, not you, or there's you, or you unintentionally. What do you think I mean by that? You unintentionally. Well, let's consider each one. Let's look through each one. So number one, when it comes to TV, what's the issue with them learning about it from TV? And I'm sure you're a very opinionated bunch. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But basically, good TV
Not real.
Makes good TV. It's totally there to entertain you. And it's fabricated. And it's not realistic. And you as sexual beings watch TV and think like, that's not quite how it works, right? But you have sexual experience. Whereas your children might be watching TV, and depending what they're exposed to at what age, that is the image that they have in the head of what sex should look like. You know, whether two people orgasm at the same time, or how quickly it takes for foreplay. Probably one of the easiest and most difficult things that I see when in sex therapy issues is that when it ends up being painful for the woman and then she becomes disinterested, is that they're just not giving enough time for foreplay. And she's not learned to listen to her body and see, am I actually ready for sex right now? That's probably like the number one issue I see. So there's this perception, and in my study also, there were people who wrote, I had a whole quantitative section, but then a whole qualitative section, and people writing like Hollywood ruined sex for me. Like I have this image of my husband coming home from work and sweeping me off my feet and taking me straight to the bedroom, and that's just not what happens. Like I've got spaghetti sauce all over my clothes, and the kids are screaming, and I just want to hand him to him and like go have like a drink in the bathroom or something. Like that's just not what happens. So there's this unrealistic image that TV has created. And if that's not then talked about, or if you're not given another option or told that that's not real, you don't know, because this is the only physical representation that you have of sex. And so you're seeing something, and that's the only point of reference that you have. There's no other point of reference. You need someone to tell you that is not realistic. Or even better yet, like don't have the mental image of it. I mean, obviously it's very hard to avoid and that's not realistic, but making sure that children know what they're being exposed to at different points. So the first thing is like creating the unrealistic expectations. And the second thing that comes from TV, which I would say is quite negative, is it creates an external set of experience. So the thing also with sex is that the more you try and think of like what it should be, what it should look like, and I mean, I'm sure we're all very comfortable with our bodies and how we look, and we've had children, so like our bodies are never going to look like people who are either in porn movies or just even actresses or supermodels. But when you haven't gone through that, and that's the only thing you're exposed to, you think this is what I should look like, this is how I should be behaving. And what you start doing is in your sexual experience, you're bringing other people into your experience. It's not an internal experience, it's an external experience where like you're thinking about what it should be look like. You're not experiencing yourself. And there's a fantastic book, which I highly recommend, called Love Worth Making. Subtitle is How to Have Ridiculously Good Sex in a Long-Term Relationship. I really recommend it for people who have been in long-term relationships. And a lot of the ideas there are about mindfulness and learning how to sort of just be in your own body and just noticing what you're feeling, what you want, what do you want to get, what's going on for you right now, and really sort of becoming very present with yourself in a singular way, as opposed to many of us, we have so much going on nowadays. You're paying your parking ticket right before you go to bed, right? Like how romantic is that? Where is your head? And thinking about it really brings this idea of sort of having these external expectations, external points of reference of what I should be acting like and how I should be feeling. I was working with a group once, and they were conducting research in a focus group, and this was completely with not Jewish people, like just normal, sexually active adults. And the one question that they all had in common was, am I normal? That is the one question that people ask, like, am I normal? Is my sex life normal? Again, with my clients, constantly like, am I having enough sex? Is it normal that I don't orgasm? Is it normal that I'm too tired? Like, that is the question people keep asking. Am I normal? Am I normal? Am I normal? There's this like internal comparison we have to others, which makes us unhappy. And part of it, not all of it, comes from because it's represented in TV or even books, right? Like fantasy novels, etc. And this is exactly what, there's a really interesting study by Stephen and Sullivan in 2009 that was looking at this comparison, social comparison theory. So what they did is they asked a bunch of university students or college students, because this was in America. They said, okay, how many sexual partners and experiences have you had, and how satisfied with it, with your experiences are you, and how many experiences do you think other people have had? And then they did the same study sometime later, and this time they gave half the group the actual results of how much everyone had, like how many sexual partners they had or sexual experiences. So if you could just guess, after the first study, well, how do you think the satisfaction correlated when there was a larger gap, when they felt, well, I've only had one partner, but the average student has had 3 or 4 partners? Do you think that meant that they had higher satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, or lower sexual satisfaction? Lower, okay. Lower, exactly, right? So the bigger the discrepancy between their experience and others' perceived experiences, the lower their sexual satisfaction. The next trial, when they gave them the actual result and said, this is what other students have actually experienced, when people realized in the experimental group that it wasn't so different from their own experience, their actual sexual satisfaction ratings went up. Isn't that crazy? Like their own sexual satisfaction went up when they realized they weren't so far off from their friends' targets. That's how influenced we are, whether we realize it or not, by other people. So the other way we can learn, our children learn about sex, is through us, but not necessarily through the way that we intend. Yes, Ilana?
I don't know if it's relevant or if you want people to share experiences, but I know that when I was growing up, Sex and the City was on TV. And I went to private girls' school, and I didn't have a lot of Jewish friends. And I just thought that this is what everybody was doing. I really just thought that this is the reality of, and it definitely shaped the choices that I made. And it definitely led that, a few years down the road, I suddenly looked around and wait, hold on a sec here. I'm the only person in my entire friendship group who's not a virgin anymore. And I was like, oh, wait. But I thought, and it was like that whole second take of, but it actually not just shaped my feelings about myself, but it shaped the choices that I made because I had a perception that wasn't real.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a very powerful story of how much exposure to a certain program completely impacted you. And also, thinking as parents, what are we allowing our children to expose themselves to? And you can choose that they can watch everything. It's just recognizing what the effect could be and having a conversation about it. So the other way that we can educate our children is through the power of a flinch. What I mean by that is that we inadvertently give them messages by not talking about it. So you might say, I'm choosing not to talk about this, right? Okay, I've made the choice. I think it's not for me to educate my children. I'll leave it to the school. I'll leave it to their friends. I'll give them a book. But then you have to think, that is saying something. That is teaching them something. You're actually making an active choice by not saying something, because what do they learn? They learn that sex is not something I can talk to my parents about. Sex is something to be embarrassed about. Sex is not appropriate. Sex is dirty. Sex is shameful. I'm naughty for wanting to have sex. I actually had a really interesting client when I was working in the psychosis service whose father was a really religious minister. And she basically grew up thinking she was evil because she started masturbating at 8, which is, not abnormal, touching herself at 8. And then she only realized what she was doing, by the time when she was 18, she realized oh, what I've been doing is actually masturbating. I just, she just did it as a self-soothing thing, which is something that happens a lot of times with people. They don't realize what they're doing until they've done it. And for this really sort of like made her feel like she was an evil person because of, the messages she got about sexuality from her home, but also that she was never guided or spoken to about what this is. So not speaking about something is saying something. And it's just important to recognize that, and we'll talk about masturbation later on, child, self-discovery. But, if you're something as like you're changing your daughter's nappy and she touches her vulva and you push her hand away, that already, it's an involuntary response perhaps on your part, but that already is saying something. And it's not about, it's just about being aware of the messages we give, just like you expect your children to learn about everything. Like maybe you never have a conversation about murder. Your children just know, you can't hit people because they watch you do it. They hear you talk about how this person hit that person and then they don't hit them. Like they take messages from you in so many ways. And it doesn't have to be through direct speaking, but they learn from you through all different ways. I'm sure this is some of the things that you covered in that talk with little kids, big pictures, big ears, how inadvertent we give our children messaging through all sorts of ways. So a very huge part of talking to your kids about sex is realizing, what are my inherited attitudes and do I want them? Are these the attitudes I want to pass over to my children? Which I really recommend thinking about, like, what are my views about sex? Sometimes, again, they're unsaid. We just inherit them. We just know what's right, know what's wrong. Many times we have involuntary responses based on our parents and their attitudes, but we know those are so outdated. Or maybe they had wonderful values. And whatever it is, it's fine. It's just about knowing what they are so you can actually be in control over what you teach your children. So what I would say, how I would summarize it comes down to two questions that you need to ask yourself. What are the things that I want my child to know, and where do I want them to learn it from? I remember I felt very strongly about these two questions after speaking to quite a religious Rebbitzin, elderly Rebbitzin, and we were talking about my thesis, my study, and she's like, you know what? My son's been married for 3 years, and to this day, I just hope his Khatan teacher taught him properly, taught him the right thing. Maybe there was no pregnancy or something, but like, she just had this, like, she's like, it cripples me every day wondering if he learned about sex in a good way, because I never had the guts to talk to him about it. And really seeing her like distress at this, I just never thought I could talk to him about the topic, and now it's too late. And I just hope it was taught in a good way. I just hope he's a good husband. It really struck me the importance of just, despite our discomfort, whatever it is, being able to have these conversations, because we want to make sure that they know what we want them to know. So I also think this is a very important religious topic. Does anyone recognize this quote at all before I say this story? Okay, there's a great story in the Gemara in Brachot 62a. I'm just going to make sure I've got the text because it's so great. So there's a rabbi called Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana went in and lay down under the bed of Rava, his teacher. Rav Kahana, heard that Rav was talking and laughing and doing his needs, i.e. having sexual intercourse with his wife. Okay, crazy story, I know. And Rav Kahana said to him, so he pops out of the bed, onto the bed, and says to him, Rav, it sounds like you've never tasted this dish before, which is meant to be a euphemism for like, it sounds like you've never had sex before, like you're enjoying it so much. And Rav said to him, Kahana, what are you doing here? I'm telling you, this is word for word in the Gemara. And he said, get out, this is not proper behavior. Rav Kahana said to him, Torah hi velilmod ani tzarich. This is Torah, and I need to learn it. So many questions on this. First of all Aggadic stories in the Gemara are not necessarily true or meant to be taken literally. They're meant to be analyzed and explored. Okay, so don't worry. I don't think there was anyone actually under any beds necessarily listening to other people have sex, but the message is very strong. There's two messages that are important here. Number one, Rav Kahana wasn't getting an education and felt he needed to go to desperate measures to understand it. Number two, we can see that sexual pleasure is very important. It is a very valid and important thing, right? Like you can enjoy sex if you're a very religious rabbi. But more important, he said to him, this is Torah and I need to learn it. Just like everything else, this is also just as important as learning the laws of lost property, as learning the laws of Shabbat. There is a proper way to do it. There is a way for it to have holiness. There is, a way for a way to connect to God through it. And I need to learn it. This is part of Torah. And we live, I think it's changing, but we definitely have changed. We've grown a lot in sort of not really seeing sex as necessarily a negative thing. There's been a big influence from Christian society into Judaism and many other cultures about the negativity of sex, which is genuinely a Christian idea about the fall of Adam and enticement and lust. And it's actually not inherently a Jewish idea. If you think of like the important, originally the top leaders in the Christian church supposed to be celibate, whereas rabbis are admonished if they do not marry and have children. Like sex is meant to be a vehicle to connect to God, to experience things in this world. The most beautiful, you have the most beautiful descriptions in Genesis of the first man and the first woman being created and joining together, and their union being called real deep knowledge of each other, and of God saying it's not good for a person to be alone. Like there's some very powerful ideas that Judaism, you're supposed to be in a relationship. You're supposed to be going through life with someone, working through with someone. Like there's that idea. And sex is a part of that. And if you think about it, God decided like that, if we believe every person has a soul, that the way to bring a part of God, a soul into this world is through sex. So it can't be all that bad, all that evil, or all that not appropriate for religion. It's something you're meant to enjoy, and it's something that has potential to be very powerful. I don't know how many people know that about Judaism, that sex in Judaism is seen as something very powerful and spiritual. And part of that is, I think, a very beautiful part of our culture that's worthy talking about. We can have another session another time about the positive side of sexuality. Not to say that there's also not some negativity, which is fine, because Judaism is a mature and nuanced religion. But there is a lot to offer in terms of sexual ethic. And it's something that's actually quite it's something that's not just important, but actually my study, which I would like to share with you some of my results, shows that actually has a lot of potential to be satisfying in your life. So as I mentioned, I had a study looking at 600 people, and it was a statistical quantitative study looking at differences between groups. And it was called Does Religion Spoil Your Sex Life? And what I found is I compared religious levels. I did it in two ways. I first asked people to identify as ultra-Orthodox, modern Orthodox, non-Orthodox. And then I also used a scale called the Centrality of Religiosity scale to divide people into groups. Are you highly religious, religious, not religious? So, some people who come up as non-Orthodox, like Masorti Reform, can come up as highly religious. And you have some people who identify as ultra-Orthodox that come in as religious or not religious. So, because what it's about is like how truly religious are you? Like how much is religion central to your life? How much do you experience God? How much do you do acts of religion in your life? And this is a scale that's used across different religions and many, many studies. So it's a really robust scale. And what I found in the scale is that people, as you can see, people who fall in the highly religious category are more sexually satisfied, which might seem really surprising. So when I explored more, like, why could that be? I looked at my results on sexual attitudes as seeing if that was important. And I looked at three types of sexual attitudes. One was called permissiveness. So how permissive are your beliefs? Like, sex is, no strings attached sex is the best, casual sex is fine, multiple partners. One was communion, which we'll talk about soon, but it basically is about the meaning of the relationship between you and the other person. And then there's one instrumentality, which is basically how much you're using the other person as a vehicle of pleasure. So what you can see here is these asterisks represent a strong correlation. So you can see the only one that's positively correlated with sexual satisfaction, which is what this first column represented, is communion. And actually permissiveness and instrumentality are negatively correlated with it. What is communion? It's not this. Communion is not, but it is the strongest predictor of sex. So what is it? This is what sexual communion is. This is what it was measuring. These 5 questions. Sex is the closest form of communication between 2 people. A sexual encounter between 2 people deeply in love is the ultimate human interaction. At its best, sex seems to be the merging of 2 souls. Sex is a very important part of life. Sex is usually an intensive, almost overwhelming experience. So you can see it's about, the value, meaning, and meaning attributed to sex in the sexual relationship. And this is what was most correlated with sexual satisfaction, which I'm guessing makes sense. It was also the thing that was very strongly correlated with high religious level. So if you look at the second column, number 2, the one of the attitudes that's most correlated with it positively is communion. And the one that's most negatively correlated, meaning the less religious you were, the more permissive your attitudes were. And so this, when I put it in a model, communion comes out as the strongest predictor of sex, so of sexual satisfaction. So you can know all the sex you want, you can watch all the sex movies you want, but what, at the end of the day, what makes a sexual experience satisfying is how deeply you connect to the person, how close, how vulnerable you feel. Which, as I say this, you're probably like, yeah, of course, that's what makes a meaningful, satisfying sexual experience. Totally not the message we're getting from Cosmopolitan and all the other sex expert guides out there. Expert guides. There's a lot of great books out there that do come up with this stuff, and definitely not what we're getting from Netflix. So I really recommend. Now we're going to go into the practical side of how to talk to your kids about sex. How do you talk to your kids about sex? The first thing is get prepared, know your stuff, think through what are my attitudes. Highly, highly, highly recommend these 2 books. You can see Robertson Landau has it right there. This is about how to pass over Jewish values and ethics and ideals to your children. She's also really broken up what you can expect, questions and development at each age. She's an educational psychologist who, as part of her PhD, wrote a whole sexual curriculum that's used in schools in Israel. And I think also she consulted with Emmanuel's school. The other book is Everything You Never Wanted Your Kids to Know About Sex, but Were Afraid They'd Ask. This is a classic old book. I think it was in 1950s first written, but reprinted in 2003. It's brilliant. Really recommend. Helps you really think about your own responses and thoughts. So just for a bit of lightheartedness, I thought I'd share with you a video about what do kids think about how babies are made. Can you hear this? Hold on. No, you can't hear it. Can you hear it? No? Okay, because I can't hear it either. No, I'll just go on to the let me just share screen.
When you share your screen, click the bottom left where it's got share audio.
I've got share sound on. Let me just go mono, stereo. If not, I'll just put it on the link directly. No, I can send you the link and you guys can watch it later. Hold on, let me just let it run a sec.
I think it would be less
my
embarrassing
computer
if
setting.
Oh wait, we can hear it now.
This afternoon,
Okay,
and we
I
asked
can't hear
you
it.
how
So.
babies are made, and we are very proud now to present the results of that inquiry for your education and pleasure.
Where do babies come from?
Ladies' tummies.
The ladies eat the babies?
No, they just get pregnant.
How are babies made?
The downstairs goes into the girls downstairs.
Do you know where babies come from? How are babies made?
Babes.
From babes?
Not from babes.
Oh, from boobs. How are babies made?
When moms and dad makes love.
What kind of blizzard makes love?
I don't know.
Do you know where babies come from?
In a little pea.
How are babies made?
They.
Why is it so funny?
It's weird.
What's weird about it?
Knowing that my parents have to do it.
Where do babies come from?
The
Explain to him.
their mom.
Their mom?
Tommy, I don't know.
You don't know? Explain to him how it works.
Explain me?
Yeah.
How they come, like, they come out of a vagina. I don't know vagina.
Do you know how babies are made?
Yeah.
How?
It say blah blah sheep, blah 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 sheep.
How are babies made?
Gross.
Why is it gross?
Because it's health.
What do you mean health?
I'm not in 5th grade yet. I should know this stuff.
What's so gross?
Just where it comes from. I've seen Star Wars, and it looks really gross and painful.
Hi, I'm Jimmy.
Okay. Any reactions to that? Why that? What did you find interesting about it? Can you hear me? Yeah. I just found the different reactions, different ages, different cultures so interesting, and like the different knowledge that they got really fascinating. I feel like I could like explore that all day. Okay, how are babies made? How do you answer these questions, right? So it's very interesting. I've got a 4-year-old son, a 7-year-old daughter, and an 18-month-old. They know like that you need an egg and a sperm. And then just the other day I was having a conversation with my son, and he was like, where does the sperm come from? And I was like, oh, it comes from the testicles. What are your testicles? They're the balls, you know, they're the sac underneath your penis that feel like your balls. He's like, oh yeah, I know those. I touch them. I like touching them lots. I can only feel one now. I don't know where the other one's gone. And like, we're just having this conversation, which was interesting because clearly he knows that that's part of his body. He didn't realize his penis was different to it. And then what was he talking? And then it came up another day on the kitchen when he said, we were talking about, he's like, yeah, because he was talking to my husband. Yeah, we have sperm in our balls that goes into into mama to make the baby, right? But I don't think he actually still has figured out that penis gets inserted in vagina, but he's like developing an understanding. Like if someone then said to him, or eventually he realized, it wouldn't be such a huge leap because already there's levels of knowledge that are age appropriate. Now you might not think age appropriate to tell a 4-year-old, but my 4-year-old has just started playing chess. So like, what is age appropriate? So really you have to, age appropriateness is based on your child, what you think your child can understand. And sometimes you'll notice that you say something to your children. I don't know if you've had this experience before, it's happened to me. You say something that might be a bit distressing, maybe you're talking about death or something, and actually they completely like ignore what you've said and just talk about something else. Or like they kind of divert the conversation. That's an example of a child really being able to process what they can process and not processing more than that, and then diverting. Like if they can't handle it, if it's too much for them, they'll just talk about something else. So what's great about it is that if you're very unsure about yourself, is that sometimes kids are good at self-regulating age appropriateness, and you just have to be aware of that. Like, you know, start saying something and then see what their reaction is. So there's plenty in those books that I mentioned, there's plenty of examples of conversation, like where a parent starts, you know, thinking like, okay, building up the courage to have the conversation, and then they realize that their child already knows most of the stuff, and they, you know, didn't need to go through all the aggravation or embarrassment, whatever it might be. The first thing would be, you know, checking out what your child already knows, not giving more information than what they ask for. So like, you know, my child didn't ask, how does the sperm get to the egg? He just asked, where does the sperm come from? So I was very much answering the specific question. I'm sure it goes without saying, but I think it's very important to always be truthful and honest with your children and use correct terminology, because what happens is that if you say something that's not right, like the stork comes and brings the baby, or that there was another really funny video that I didn't bring, but like, you know, daddy goes to the hospital and there's all the babies in cages and they give him a key and he takes the baby home, like, and then they find out the truth, they'll feel that you lied to them, didn't trust them, didn't think that they were mature enough to handle it. And then that feeds into other ways of how they relate to you. So it is important how you choose to speak to answer your children. I actually think it's, even if it's awkward, it's always easier at the first instance to just be as honest, truthful, and biological as you can. And always it's important to assess the response. Was it too much? You don't need to push it. Like I said, that you're talking about something and then they just talk about like what they had for lunch or their dolly, just go with it. You don't, clearly they're not ready, and they'll come back to it when they want to and they're ready. I highly recommend to get the conversation out of the way whilst they're young. For those of you who are 14-year-olds and haven't talked to them about it, definitely going to be more awkward than talking to them about it when they're 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. And actually, sex is still gross to them. It's like the equivalent of saying, put your nose in someone else's mouth and blow. Like that's, the thought of it, there's no sexuality attached to it. It's just a thing that people do to make babies. And that's probably the easiest time to talk about sex, when it's not related to that embarrassment. And also children as their teens develop natural modesty, natural embarrassment as they're going through adolescence. And I think it's better to get out of the way before that. 100% what one of you said before, small talks versus big talks, much easier. Instead of having the talk, slowly over the years, mention something here, mention something there when you have an opportunity for it. When something comes up on TV, talk about it. They've watched something. I mean, I know Disney films more and more are becoming like more telling of things. And so, using opportunities and seeing it as a long-term education, bit by bit forever, until they're 21, 25, 30. They will come to you for marriage advice if you have a good relationship with them and you want to be there for them in the times when they're most vulnerable and don't know who else to turn to. So I hope that that's some practical tips. We'll keep going on. When does the conversation start? My answer is before it becomes an issue. So again, highly recommend always starting from a young age. Using correct terminology for body parts is a really easy way to ease yourself in. Once you start using names, you're already talking about like a sense of embarrassment or shame or difference of the area. And Ilana, you're a biological teacher. I'm sure you strongly advocate for the actual use of the word, the terminology.
Definitely.
Yeah, and the most important thing is showing your children you can talk about it with honesty and dignity. So I've actually never struggled to talk about this in front of, I was trying to teach a GCSE curriculum to like 15-year-old boys about Freud's theory of sexual development. I've gone into JFS and literally said, like, ask me any questions you want and all sorts of questions. And the fact that I'm not fazed by it, I'm not embarrassed by it, shows. And first of all, as soon as like the first question goes and I just answer it very seriously, there's no laughter anymore because I'm taking them seriously. Even if they ask the craziest questions, I answer it seriously. That also shows me we can have a conversation about it. It doesn't have to be awkward and bravado and not really talking about it. Like, we can just talk about it honestly and in a dignified way, which is the message you really want to be giving over. As I mentioned before, the earliest start where this conversation happens really is infancy and the whole process of attachment, which is when you really start developing, when your child cries and you go and you hold them close to your body. What are you teaching them in that instance? Comfort comes from drawing close to people that you love. You're giving, when you delight in their bodies, you're showing them that your body is something to love. So really all of this stuff about sexuality, bodies actually starts from infancy. So to kind of delay the conversation doesn't really make sense. It's something to happen throughout childhood as a part of development. Okay, I know we want to leave time for questions, but I do want to talk a bit about masturbation, doctors, and I have 3 slides left. So if it's okay with you, I just want to make sure I cover that material properly, and then we'll stop for questions. Okay, self-discovery, and I've written here masturbation ? And the reason I've written that is because are they the same thing? Is masturbation and self-discovery the same thing? I don't think so, because when a 4 or 5-year-old girl or boy is touching their genital area, it's not sexual. What they've done is they've just found a part of their body that feels good. There's lots of nerve endings there, and it feels great. Why would I not touch it? There's a great story. I can't remember which book it is. I think it's the one that the things that you never wanted your children to know about, where a mum is sitting with her son and like every night she reads him the story, and as she's reading him the story, his hands are always in his trousers and he's always playing with his penis. And one day she mentioned something about it and like, oh, do you like that? Like, you always play with it. He's like, Mommy, if you had one, you would play with it all the time too. Like, it's just fun. Like, it's a thing that's fun, that's there. So it's important to really separate that. And when we feel embarrassed about our children touching themselves, actually that's our sexuality coming through. That's our sexual embarrassment, other people's sexual embarrassment coming through and being sort of put on the child, because they're not sexual beings yet. It's not a sexual thing. And that's, I think, such an important thing as a parent, to be able to dissociate what's my stuff, what's their stuff. And thinking, and this is where the involuntary reactions come from, because you might be like shock horrified if you have your guest there and your daughter has figured out that, you know, rocking on the edge of the armchair feels really good and is all of a sudden really flustered. You might just be shock horrified and like say, oh my gosh, go to your own room, stop what you're doing now. But then you're also sending a message like what you're doing is wrong. And that's where you need to catch yourself and really think about, what would I respond in that situation? How would I react? Which goes back to what this talks about and also those books are about. It can start anywhere from age 2 to 7, depending on when they realize it feels good. What does it look like? It looks like rubbing or stimulating the area. Boys don't ejaculate until they actually hit puberty, but they can have mini orgasms from stimulation. If we think about it in another way, like if we remove the salience of it by saying, okay, what about thumb sucking, right? Like thumb sucking is not something you want your child to be doing continuously as an adult. I mean, obviously there's some people who still actually do struggle with that as adulthood, but the way you talk to them about it is not as like intense. Like even if they're thumb sucking in you know, in school, in assembly, and you're trying to stop them doing it, the way you do that would be in a very different, sensitive way, as opposed to how sometimes people react immediately to masturbation. And it's important to think about that. What is normal and what is abnormal, which I think is an important thing to point out. So generally, we only like to call something abnormal if it's interfering with the day-to-day activity. So it is very normal to discover parts of your body and figure out how they work. And I do have many clients who still at the ages of 22, 23 have been married, still don't feel comfortable touching their vaginas and their vulvas, which is, you know, clearly something that's been inherited through development. What is abnormal when your child is using it, and this is where I would recommend you seek guidance, if they're using it to regulate their emotions excessively, if they're choosing to go and touch themselves instead of socializing with others or doing other activities, and also not being able to start realizing, you know, appropriate, inappropriate social situations, then you might need to see like, well, what is their need? What is their need to touch? So I actually just currently seeing a client who would, you know, kind of, because she was bored, she would go and just masturbate several times a day in the bathroom. And she did this until she was like well into her adulthood. And she didn't really think about it until then it started causing issues in her marriage. So it's definitely something to think about, talk about, try and work through if you think that there's, you know, a problem with it. And it is a tricky message, recognizing what is bad and what is only bad in some context, but that is part of teaching of children about life, right? It's complex. And what was the other point about this? Sorry. Yeah, of course, whatever the age, respond with respect and acceptance, with rational and consistent limits. So that's really important, to keep consistent messages. We were playing doctors, what to do if you catch your child and another person's child exploring each other's bodies, which can happen. So it's normal discovery. Like we said, they're not necessarily sexual, but at the same time, they need to know what is appropriate and that their body is their own body, and they can only, you know, share it with others if they give the permission to do so. And this is when you would start teaching about consent. And also, so the way the conversation would go here is like making sure everyone was actually comfortable with what's going on, and there was not one person sort of pressurizing the other person to play in a certain way. And thinking about when you walk into that room and you react to it, just thinking about like, well, what if my child was doing this in their friend's house? How would their parent react to it? And what would that child feel, the other child and your child? And really thinking about managing embarrassment and emotions there. And again, this is a very normal thing to happen at some point in childhood. And the main thing is, how do you manage discovering that and help them realize where to go forward? So for example, teaching them that it's okay to play doctors as long as everyone really wants to play. And also maybe putting some guidelines like, you know, it's okay to play doctors if everyone keeps on their underwear. And thinking about if you have, you know, that you definitely should report to the other parent what you found, but to do it in a way that wouldn't get that child in trouble in any way, and the feelings that will come from that. And this is where you'd have to think about privacy versus secrecy. And this is definitely a complicated discussion to have. At another time, we can explore it more, or you can read those books. It has some great stuff about it. Making sure that your children know the difference between privacy and then keeping a secret. We don't want secrets, but we do want an understanding what privacy could be. So example conversations that you could have about these topics would be, was that a game that you and Johnny were playing? Does it have a name? How do you play? To understand a bit what's going on, to really fully understand. Was it fun for you? Sometimes not everyone wants to play. Did everyone want to play? Okay, and in terms of like self-discovery, I can see it makes you feel good to touch your penis. Even though it feels good, touching your penis is something you do in a private place, such as the bathroom or your bedroom. And another really important way to help your children learn these lessons is through, like for example, when you're bathing your children, is the way you interact with your children when they're naked. And at some point, giving them responsibility to wash their own body parts, saying, well, that's your body part. Why don't you wash it? So finally, really a big part of this is not just about teaching them like what sex is, but really mostly it's about what are the values you want to pass on to them. Of course, there's privacy versus secrecy, boundaries, consent, essential across all areas. The very complicated idea that sex is a good thing, just not for now. Sex is something to be shared with your special person. And there's Jewish guidance, halachot, related to our bodies and sex, just like any other area of our life that we can then make as a spiritual experience. Thank you. I hope there's still a bit of time for questions.
Absolutely. I'm just gonna stop the live stream. So if anybody does want to ask questions, that they don't feel uncomfortable that it's being recorded. So just bear with me 1 second. Yeah. Ilana, if you start, if you don't, I'm just going to assume you don't care if yours is on the live stream.
I guess I have some questions. I mean, I've taken a very prosaic approach, very similar to some of the things that you've said during your talk. I teach